Welcome in to our first Friday wrap up at the Pentagon. Now, most of you out there are just like me. You had no idea that the fine people at the Pentagon did a huge news dump, or not did, do a huge news dump, usually around Friday quitting time there in Washington, D.C. There's only one man who knows exactly what is going on. It's Pentagon reporter and good friend to the station here, Tom Squitieri. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. As people who are watching can see, I'm not at the Pentagon at the moment. I'm in my living room. But they ended a little bit earlier today, thankfully, and made it nice and easy for me to get home. But as you say, Chuck, Friday afternoons, Friday night are big news days, believe it or not, because not just the Pentagon, but much of Washington likes to dump things out Friday because it's a slow news cycle. People are leaving town. They're going home for the evening. Let me give you an example. May I?
Oh, of course.
So, as you and I talked about on your other show yesterday, there was this Russian flotilla off the coast of Florida, 3 ships and a submarine. They were trailed by a couple U.S. ships and a Canadian ship and Coast Guard. They went and docked in Cuba, as they said they would. Well, guess what? A U.S. submarine also made it to Cuba. Now, for listeners who may be scratching their head, how can a U.S. submarine go to Cuba? The United States has a military base on Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. You've probably heard about that. A lot of people have.
It seems like that's been in the news.
Yeah, it's a long-term lease on it, and Guantanamo is where we put the suspected terrorists from 9/11 and other places, and from Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. They've been sitting there for a long time, many of them innocent, but that's a whole other story. But U.S. Southern Command, which Cuba kind of falls into that, announced yesterday that there was a submarine, one of our nuclear submarines, that made a visit there. This visit was pre-planned, Chuck, they said, pre-planned way before the Russians went there, So it's interesting because the Pentagon rarely announces movements of nuclear submarines. If you ask them, they won't do it. But there it is. It was the USS, let me see, Helena. And it's a nuclear submarine. So there it is in Cuba with the Russians right around the corner.
So the novice is going to assume that, number one, the fact that they're just doing it, and number two, the announcement is because Russia sent some warships just around Cuba the earlier this week. So is that what this is? Probably.
I think so.
They're
They're going to deny it, as they said in the statement. This is part of the location and transit were previously planned. That's what U.S. Southern Command insists that was previously planned. So, it could have been previously planned, but that could mean planned on Tuesday, or planned when they learned that the Russians were going to be heading to Cuba off the Florida coast. They could have planned it then. So, technically they could be accurate. It was previously planned. Question is, when was it previously planned? And when you ask them that question, not just for this one, but similar ones, well, we can't talk about that. That's national security issues. So,
Tom, one of the announcements that came out yesterday, and this is a story, if you listen to my radio show every Tuesday and Thursday, Tom's on with us, and we've been talking about this for well over a year, and you're the first person who really brought this to my attention, and I've taken deep dives into it. But Saudi Arabia, a member of the BRICS alliance, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and handful of other nations now. Saudi
Arabia. It's a new member, right? Mm-hmm. This year.
They are a new member. They announced that they are going to do some of their oil trading off of the U.S. dollar. What's been the reaction in Washington today?
Well, that's an interesting move by Saudi Arabia. This is a stated goal of several BRICS members, as we've talked about before. China really wants to have it happen because the theory is if you want to weaken the United States as sort of the world superpower, you want to get the world off the dollar. The dollar, whether countries like the United States or not, many of them still use the dollar. And I was always surprised when I went to countries that were not necessarily friendly to the United States, but their dollar was either their legitimate currency, or a currency that they use frequently. Some countries basically use the dollar as their currency, even though it wasn't officially it. That really bothers countries like Iran and China and others. Now, Saudi Arabia wants to have it both ways. They want to be a friend of the United States. They want to have U.S. military support, obviously. They want to be able to use their oil to create sway within the United States decision making. But they also want to be part of this sort of a non-aligned movement that BRICS is a big part of. China, as I said, is pushing their currency. It's interesting. The Chinese currency is going to be accepted by some nations, but not by others, because they don't want to replace one foreign currency with another necessarily. And they're not that all sure about how China's going to behave once their currency is the currency. But you asked about the reaction in Washington. I didn't get to that. The reaction is not happy, even though it's just part of their oil money that's being shifted away from the dollar. Any kind of door opening on this movement is frowned upon by the United States, because they can see it kind of getting momentum depending on how circumstances are in the world. You and I have talked about this a lot, and on paper, it sounds really good for some countries to move away from the United States dollar because they think it gives them more economic freedom. But in reality, it may limit their limit their options in at least the short term, because other countries are continuing to trade with the dollar. So now, if other countries now follow Saudi's lead within OPEC, let's say, or within BRICS, then it would be an issue more worthwhile to worry about. For right now, it's being watched. They call it. We continue to monitor and analyze the situation. It's puzzling, however. But Saudi Arabia, as I said earlier, they want to have it both ways. They want to be nice to China, and they want to be nice to the United States.
Before we transition into the G7 and a huge press conference yesterday with President Biden and President Zelensky there at the I guess that was at the G7, right? Is that where I saw the press conference? Okay. Right. Before we transition to that, I want to ask you this, because the BRICS thing, if you start looking it up and you start reading into it, you will be, as an American, you will be concerned, I would think. We saw this reaction, if you will, with, hey, we're going to send a nuclear sub around Cuba too, just something that was planned. Do we ever talk, what are we using to combat this idea of BRICS? What is it? I mean, because you and I, we may be the only people talking about it, but surely someone else in Washington knows about it too. Do we ever have conversations about how to combat this? Because this would be very detrimental if something like this took off to the Americans.
I think there are conversations that are not public conversations. I don't hear much public discussion of it within official ranks of Washington, not even on Capitol Hill that much. I mean, you have some members of Congress talking about it, they're concerned. I hear more of it in conversations in think tanks when they have events about that, because they talk about these issues much more. And they have a lot of smart people who go to these, people who used to be in the government, people who are experts, in certain areas that are relevant. I find them very beneficial and educational. The U.S. policy to combat BRICS is that we try to have good working relations with most of the countries in BRICS. So, Brazil, we have a pretty good relationship. It comes and goes. They have a new president now. Or India, obviously, is very much a lone player in BRICS, even though it's part of BRICS. They really are a country, as we've talked about a lot. They do what's best for India. They buy Russian oil. They're very friendly to the United States. And, of course, China and India are not the best of friends. And India has gotten closer to the United States in several areas that could be considered to counter China. So, to look at BRICS as one organization, it's made up of members that really think differently and think a lot for themselves. So that's what's so interesting. What Saudi Arabia is doing is on its own, but it's not a BRICS type of thing. And again, we talked about this before, worth saying again, and that is that because of the diverse nature of the members in BRICS, it's going to be difficult for them to get a unanimous front on a lot of issues, or they can even go ahead and vote to do something and agree to do something, but each member will do what they want. So that's part of the reason why it's not overly concerning to the United States right now about what we talk about. Saudi Arabia decided they're going to do it. This was something that other countries thought BRICS would do as a group. They have not.
Tom, as we move over into from Saudi Arabia into Europe in the G7 meeting, I caught the very tail end of the press conference live yesterday, and I haven't gone back and watched it yet. But I do remember them saying that the 10-year, is it a security agreement? Is that what
Yeah,
we're calling, where we'll train the Ukrainian soldiers and things like that, that President Biden announced yesterday? Am
yeah,
I right with that?
yeah, right. There were two big announcements yesterday, two different 10-year deals. One with the United States and Ukraine, as you touched on, and the other with Japan and Ukraine. The Japanese one is more monetary. They're giving them $4.5 billion this year, and they're going to have a 10-year program to support their with humanitarian and technical assistance, a little reconstruction efforts, and also, more sanctions against Russia. The U.S. agreement with Ukraine is also for 10 years, and it's more focused on training, as you put, defense and security. There is some economic recovery and reform. That's a big deal of the United States packages. Ukraine government had corruption in it before Zelensky took over as president. Still does. He's got a lot. He's gotten rid of a lot of it, but it's still an issue within the Ukrainian government that concerns both European and U.S. individual, people who deal with Ukraine, because corruption is a terrible, terrible thing in any government, and in a new government striving to be a strong democracy like Ukraine under attack from Russia, it's particularly hazardous. And so there's also, long-term advancement, and I love this phrase, into Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. What does that mean? Well, that's a way you don't have to say NATO or EU. That way you don't pin down either organization. In other words, the United States is going to continue to work to bring Ukraine, for lack of better phrasing, into the West, into part of what Europe is now. That would be NATO at some point. That would be the European Union at some point. But no timetable given, no firm commitment to it. So they come up with this phrase, Euro-Atlantic integration. Sounds pretty good. It's not what Ukraine wanted, obviously. Now, at least one more thing that's important about this agreement with Ukraine and the United States for 10 years. This is not a treaty. This is not a treaty. It doesn't have to be ratified by the Senate like foreign treaties have to be. That's a pro and that's a con. The pro means it can go into effect right away. The con means anyone else who becomes president could just end it.
Was there not an agreement? Oh, you're talking about on our side.
Correct.
When you said anybody that's a president, could it be ended on Ukraine's side as well?
Probably.
Although
Yeah.
I don't know why they would. But
I got to be candid. I don't know how, structures. I don't know how their government works that well. I don't know how, if they have to approve. But it's not a treaty. It's an agreement. So, whether they have to approve an agreement, I don't know how their government works on that.
it seems like I heard someone say about yesterday at the G7 that Ukraine also had an understanding with China when it came to weapons that would be supplied to Russia. Am I right about that?
I don't know
Or
about
not
that.
supplying Russian weapons? Or that may have been a TikTok thing.
I don't know about that. To be honest with you, I haven't heard that. I would be look. I think President Zelensky and others in Ukraine are pretty smart, and they would rightfully be skeptical of anything that China says at this point in regards to weapons that they being China are not supplying to Russia. China. There's a big peace conference. I'm trying to find in my notes here. There's a big peace conference coming up in Switzerland. Okay, in regards to Ukraine. Vice President Harris and Secretary Blinken and others are going over to represent the United States. China isn't going to go. In fact, they're actively trying to push countries not to attend as well. It's June 15th. It starts tomorrow. It's over this weekend in Switzerland. China is pushing their own peace plan regarding Ukraine, some 6-point plan that it unveiled with Brazil. You might remember we talked about this briefly about a month ago. And that calls for direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And that's the one that they want to have happen. So Ukraine's not too cool on that plan. They prefer the one that might come out of Switzerland. So I think going back, President Zelensky will, obviously he'll listen to the Chinese. It's a big country. It's an important country. But he's going to take it with a grain of salt.
When it comes to different countries supplying Russia, different weapons that's used in Ukraine. We talked a few months ago, maybe even as far back as a year ago, about Iran and the drones that, some drones Russia was using. Do we know, is any of that calmed down a little bit with the tensions, obviously, in the Middle East being really high? A month or so
No.
ago, Israel attacked the Iranian consulate. Iran fired some missiles at Israel. The Iron Dome got them. Are they still supplying drones, or was that a one-time purchase?
Is Iran supplying drones to
Russia.
Russia? Yeah, they're still supplying drones to Russia. As in North Korea, that the trade, the war trade, shall we say, between Iran and Russia, North Korea and Russia has continued and probably expanded, and it's reciprocal. That's the thing. That's one of the things that is concerning to the Pentagon and others, is that now Iran has better synchronization of its missiles because of Russian technology. North Korea has better technology for its nuclear program. It's not just its rockets, but the actual nuclear weapons themselves, or potential nuclear weapons. So that trade between those three countries via Russia, Iran, Russia, North Korea, Russia, that's continuing. And that's something that's really concerning, because now you have all these bad actors learning technical ways to make their weapons better and more lethal. In a shorter period of time, they're learning this. I want to touch on something you said about when things calm down. We didn't talk about this, I don't think, this week, because it was kind of off our cycle. But Israel hit targets in Lebanon, and they took out an Iranian general, not a Hezbollah leader. It was, again, an Iranian military official who was the liaison from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and he was taken out by the Israelis this week. That's another big target taken out by them. So, and there was no outcry from Iran this time that we saw the last time, which is, to me, interesting, which of course is a word I use a lot.
I was going to say maybe concerning too, a little bit.
Well, part of it is also you hit them when they don't have a president. Remember, their president died in a helicopter crash a short while ago, and so they really don't have a political leader per se, and they're having an election at the end of this month. They pick 6 candidates who can win. That's none of them.
That's a quick election. I don't feel like we would of course, I know we have things in place: vice president, speaker of the House, all that. But I don't feel like we would.
The thing about
react
to diverge a little bit from our topic, it always strikes me how incredible long our elections are now. And in Britain, they call elections going to be in July 4th. Macron of France just called an election. The first round is June 30th. The middle round, second and final round is July something. Iran calls an election, and it's 4 weeks, 3 weeks from when they call it. Because of the parliamentary systems in those countries, it's a lot different, than the presidential election in this country, or even the congressional elections in this country. That's why ours are so long and those countries are so short. Not advocating one way or the other. It's just, these are major countries too. Talking about Iran, France, and Great Britain. Those are big countries. They're going to pull off these elections.
If you ever get bored on a weekend, you want to just Google parliamentary fights in Great Britain. It's phenomenal watching.
Oh yeah, I love that stuff. I always like to watch question time. I forget. That used to be on Thursdays, I think, where the prime minister, whoever he or she is, goes to the House of Commons, and they're asked direct questions by any member, and it's pretty impressive.
It gets heated. Yeah. One last thing, and this is something we all remember, and everybody's been talking about. It's a little bit light of a story for a Pentagon reporter, but important nonetheless. Joey Chestnut, who is probably one of the top 5 most dominant American athletes of all time, owns almost every record at the Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest. It's the only reason that we watch that thing is to see if Joey Chestnut will break his own record. It's a foregone conclusion. He's going to win it every single year. Nathan's Hot Dogs, which I'm a fan of, by the way.
Yeah.
Nathan's Hot Dogs have decided to ban him because he signed a deal with Impossible Foods, which, from what I understanding, we don't get this a lot here in West Tennessee, but from my understanding, is food that looks like a hot dog but it's made from vegetables.
Correct. They have hot dogs and they have burgers, and I think they also have chicken patties as well. But they're not meat, as you said. Yeah. So that was announced earlier this week. Joey Chestnut owns the hot dog eating contest, which is sponsored by Nathan's, and he owns about 12 or 13 other food eating. There's actually a Major League Food League or something like that. Now, I think it's funny because funny that he's been tossed out of this thing on July 4th, and then a day later, it was announced that Chestnut's going to face his big rival. I'm going to see if I can get his name correctly. Takura Kobayashi. I got the last name.
Kobayashi, you got it. I actually knew a name that you may not have known. Unfortunately, you got it right.
Yeah, Kobayashi, and they're going to have what they call on a Labor Day competitive eating thing. It's called, quote, unfinished beef, which I think is pretty funny. Unfinished beef they're going to have, and they're going to have like a showdown then. So he got tossed from Labor Day. Now, I think Netflix or someone's going to carry that, so that'll be interesting to see.
They're going to make a ton of money with it. It's a big part of Labor Day. If you were to look there it's from what I understand, Tom, I've never been in New Jersey, but I think this is the only reason anyone goes is to see Joey Chestnut. They're in New Jersey every year at the Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest.
That's on Long Island. That's Coney Island.
Oh, is that Coney Island? I thought it was in New Jersey. Okay, well then there's no reason for anyone to go to New Jersey. Never mind.
Coney Island, yeah. And
okay, well that would make sense.
But I thought this, boy, Kobayashi, and that was like a great rivalry, But I would say, some people would argue that let's put a Pentagon twist on it. You notice on the whole list of the foods where there's food eating records, no one's tried it. No one's like MREs or how many MREs can you eat? Meals ready to eat. That would be
That's a good point. That would be in somewhere. Somebody has. Yeah, it's usually like Crystal Burgers, hot dogs, pizza. That kind of stuff.
I think that Chestnut also owns the record for Twinkies. You know what those are, right? Twinkies.
Oh, well, of course I do. I'm just saying eating a ton of those at a time, like really quickly, would be tough. Tom Squitieri, always great stuff. Okay, we'll do this every Friday. Yeah, you too, my friend. We'll talk to you.
All right, bye. That go okay?